Welcome to Sleepy Historian, where old tales whisper by candlelight, and memories gently drift into dreams. Tonight, let us journey back to a time long asleep in history. She was not born in a palace. She was not a princess. She did not come from royal blood. Anne Boleyn entered the world around the year 1501, perhaps at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, or maybe at Hever Castle in Kent, where her father, Thomas Boleyn, served as an ambitious diplomat. Her family belonged to the English gentry, noble enough for opportunity, yet modest enough to remain untethered by rigid expectations. Even as a child, Anne was different. While most girls were taught to sew and remain silent, Anne was sent across the sea. First to the Netherlands, then to France. There, she lived among poets, musicians, and noble ladies of the court. She breathed in the spirit of the Renaissance, a world of humanist thinking, elegance, art, and freedom of mind. These were things that, in England, still felt like distant whispers of a new world. She learned quickly. She spoke French fluently, observed shrewdly, and moved with effortless poise. Anne learned how to speak like a lady of letters, and more importantly, she learned the quiet power of knowing her own worth. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was no longer the shy girl who had once left home. She returned with the scent of the French court clinging to her grace, boldness, and a confidence that both startled and fascinated. In a court filled with obedient and predictable women, Anne was radiant. Not the most traditionally beautiful, no, but something in her eyes, her voice, her smile, her presence. It drew the attention of even the most powerful men in England. Anne knew how to enchant, but she refused to be conquered. She was clever, measured, and always one thoughtful step ahead. Anne Boleyn did not follow the rules. She rewrote them, and that made her dangerous, especially in a court where women were only ever expected to smile, bow, and remain silent. Henry VIII was one of the most powerful and famous kings of England, a confident, commanding man who was used to getting anything he wanted. When the king's eyes landed on Anne Boleyn, many believed it would be just another fleeting affair like so many before. But Anne was not like other women, and that marked the beginning of an unprecedented storm of politics, religion, and personal obsession. Anne refused to become a mistress. She had seen what happened to her sister, Mary Boleyn, once Henry's lover, later cast aside without mercy. Anne knew that if she gave her heart and her body without a title, she would soon be forgotten by history. And she was not born to be forgotten. She refused gently, wisely, but firmly. Henry was drawn not just to her looks, but to her refusal. In a time when women were taught to submit and be modest, her defiance made an irresistible. The king began writing letters to her, hundreds of them, with a tone of longing never seen before. He promised, he pleaded, and then, gradually, he proposed something unthinkable: marriage. To have Anne, Henry was willing to do what no English king had ever done: divorce Queen Catherine of Aragon, who had been by his side for nearly 20 years. But the Catholic Church forbade it. The Pope said no. And so, the affair with Anne became more than a matter of the heart. It became a showdown between the King of England and the supreme authority of European religion. The love between Anne and Henry, though not yet official, had already become the catalyst for a full-blown revolution. Because one woman refused to be a mistress, a nation was about to change course, where religion, power, and marriage would never be the same again. Henry had married Catherine, the widow of his older brother, out of political duty, and for many years, they were a stable royal couple. But after several failed pregnancies and only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary, Henry began to feel disheartened. Deep down, he believed their marriage was cursed by God, because Catherine had once been married to his brother. Then came Anne Boleyn, like a gust of fresh wind through the corridors of court. She brought not only passion and ambition, but also the promise of a male heir, of a new beginning. Henry decided it was time to end everything. He wrote to the Pope in Rome, requesting an annulment. The arguments were framed in religious doctrine, but everyone knew the truth. He wanted to be free, to marry Anne Boleyn. But the Pope could not give in. Catherine was not just queen, she was also the aunt of Charles V, the powerful emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Granting Henry's request would insult one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and that was unthinkable. Henry would not take no for an answer. In his mind, a radical idea took shape. If the Pope would not give permission, why should he, the King of England, not become the head of his own church? And so, in a series of earth-shaking moves, Henry VIII broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He ruled that he had the authority to decide the fate of his own marriage, and declared his union with Catherine null and void. Shortly after, he secretly married Anne. The shockwaves of that decision tore through England and far beyond. It opened the door to a sweeping wave of religious reform across Europe. A single divorce born of love, desire, and ambition had changed not only religion, but the very political and spiritual identity of a nation. And at the center of it all was Anne Boleyn. In the year 1533, after years of waiting, of fighting, of defying the most powerful institutions in Europe, Anne Boleyn finally achieved something no other woman had dared even to dream. She became Queen of England. Her marriage to Henry VIII had been conducted in secret, but soon it was publicly declared valid. The newly formed Church of England, created by Henry himself, ruled that his previous marriage to Catherine was null and void. Just months later, Anne was crowned queen in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. At the time, she was already pregnant, and all of England held its breath, hoping the child would be a son. The long-awaited heir Henry had yearned for over 2 decades. Henry was enchanted, almost bewitched by her. He believed God had led him to Anne, that all the struggles, all the broken alliances, and all the fury from Rome had been worth it. For this, if the child was a boy, then everything would be justified. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl, not a prince, but a daughter, Elizabeth. It was a crushing blow to Henry's dream. Though he tried to appear pleased, deep down, disappointment began to grow. A daughter could not inherit the throne under the laws of the time, and Elizabeth's birth, no matter how precious, did not strengthen Anne's position at court. Not long after, Anne became pregnant again. All hope shifted to this new life. But the child was lost. And then, another. Each miscarriage pushed Henry further away. And with each step he took back, Anne seemed less like the woman who had once inspired a kingdom to change, and more like the source of his growing misfortunes. People began to whisper that Anne was cursed, that she was never meant to be queen, that she had divided the church, isolated England, and failed in the one thing a queen was meant to do, produce a male heir. And so, the woman once celebrated as a symbol of renewal, now began to fade into a shadow of suspicion and disappointment. The love of a king is like fire, brilliant, fierce, but quick to fade. Anne Boleyn, who had once been the wind that stirred passion in Henry VIII's heart, could now feel the cold quietly creeping into the space between them. After Elizabeth's birth, the weight of expectations settled heavily on Anne's shoulders, and with every miscarriage that followed, the king's gaze grew more distant, more unfamiliar. Henry was not a man who bore disappointment well. To him, everything, even love, had to serve a purpose. And when Anne could no longer give him what he wanted most, a son, the love between them began to feel less like a gift, and more like an inconvenience. It was around this time that Jane Seymour appeared. She was gentle, quiet, calm, not as sharp or dazzling as Anne had once been, but exactly the kind of ideal wife the court now longed for. Jane didn't stand out, not in the way Anne had. But it was her silence, her stillness, her sweet obedience, that Henry found himself drawn to. She was the perfect opposite of the woman who had once led him to defy a pope and append a kingdom. Henry began to spend more time with Jane. The gifts, the glances, the soft smiles that had once belonged to Anne now belonged to someone else. And Anne, clever as she was, could not help but see it. The king's heart had left her, and now it rested in the hands of another woman. Love had faded, but something far more dangerous had begun to grow. Anne was no longer simply a queen who had lost favor. She had become a symbol of religious division, of lost alliances, of a kingdom pushed to the edge. Anne tried to reclaim his attention with wit, with charm, with the very same brilliance that had once captivated him. But it was too late. Henry no longer saw her as a wife, but as a mistake, one that needed to be corrected. And when the king's love died, it did not leave behind an empty space. It left behind a blade, waiting patiently for the moment it would fall. When a queen loses the love of her king, it is dangerous. But for Anne Boleyn, losing love was not the most terrifying thing. The true danger was losing protection. When Henry turned away, the political wolves began to stir. At the front of the pack stood Thomas Cromwell, once an ally, now an enemy. Cromwell had been Henry's right hand during the Reformation, the architect of the Church of England. But he and Anne were never the same. Anne had dreamed of a gentler church, one shaped by Renaissance ideals and moral reform. Cromwell saw the church as a tool for power, for land, for control. Though they once stood beside the king, their paths had always diverged. As Henry's affection for Anne faded, Cromwell sensed his moment. He knew, once love is gone, all that's needed is an excuse. And so, the accusations began, not rooted in truth, but in fear, ambition, and calculation. Anne was charged with adultery, with multiple men including her own brother, George Boleyn. They claimed she had committed incest, that she had betrayed her husband, that she had plotted to kill the king himself. There was no clear evidence, only whispers. But whispers, in court, could roar. No one came to her defense. Those who had once followed her stayed silent. Even her family could do nothing. Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace, quietly, after a small celebration, and taken to the Tower of London, once a place of royal majesty, now her prison, a fortress of betrayal. Once, she had been clever. Once, she had commanded the court with her words, her mind, her presence. But now, not a single word could save her. Not when the king no longer listened, not when Cromwell had already set the stage and written the script. And the woman who had changed the fate of a kingdom was now recast, not as a heroine, but as a symbol of sin, of disloyalty, and of ruin, even if the truth was never proven. On the 15th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn stepped into the courtroom, the place where her fate would be decided, but not by truth, only by the will of the powerful. It was a large chamber, filled with cold, pale light, seats arranged for nobles, courtiers, and accusers. Everything had been prepared long before she arrived. The verdict in truth had already been written, even before the trial began. Anne did not tremble. She walked tall, wearing a deep black gown with a high collar. Her gaze was proud, yet calm. Before her lay the weight of monstrous accusations: adultery, incest, treason, plotting the king's death. Each charge alone could lead to the scaffold. Together, they formed a noose. The evidence was little more than whispers, rumors, manipulated schedules, imagined conversations. There were no neutral witnesses, no lawyer to defend her. This trial had not been built to uncover the truth. It was a ritual, a ceremony to sanctify a decision born not of justice, but of a king's frozen heart. Anne defended herself. She denied every charge. Her voice was steady. She spoke of honor, of loyalty, and of the deep pain of being betrayed by the man she had once loved. But in that room, no one truly listened. Not because they believed she was guilty, but because silence was safer. To speak for Anne was to stand against the king, and no one was brave or foolish enough to do that. After a pause that felt like mockery, the court delivered its sentence: death. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, the woman who had led Henry VIII to break with Rome, was handed over to the executioner. As she was led away from the courtroom, those who had once bowed to her turned their faces. No one reached out a hand, no one spoke. The trial had ended, but justice never came. On the morning of May 19, 1536, the sky over London was thick and gray. There were no church bells, no final procession. But everyone knew, today, a queen would die. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, a woman once adored and hated with equal passion, was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Once, it had been her royal home. Now, it was her place of execution. Henry, in a strange gesture, had ordered that she not be beheaded with the traditional axe, but with a sword, brought from France, and wielded by a skilled French executioner. Was it a final act of mercy, or just a cruel kind of ceremony for the woman he had once loved enough to break an entire continent? Anne wore a deep gray dress, a black silk cap, no jewels, no paint upon her face. She walked softly. She did not cry. Witnesses say she smiled, gently, and carried peace within her to the very end. At the scaffold, she spoke a few quiet words. Not to accuse, not to beg, not to curse. She did not ask to live. She did not speak the king's name. In those final moments, Anne chose silence. A silence noble, cutting, and full of pain. Then she knelt. The executioner said softly, "Look to God, madam." And in the very next breath, the sword fell. Quick, clean, no scream, no crowd cheering. Only the sound of the wind brushing against the cold stone walls of the tower. Anne's body was buried in a simple wooden box. No grave marker, no funeral rites, a quiet, aching end. For the woman who had once changed the fate of a kingdom. But death can never fully erase a person. Silence is not the same as forgetting. Though the court tried to erase her name from history, just one generation later, that name returned and echoed, louder than ever before. Anne Boleyn was gone, but her legacy could not be buried with her body beneath the cold stones of the Tower of London. Because the daughter she left behind, Elizabeth, would go on to do what no one in England could have imagined. She would become the greatest queen in the nation's history. Elizabeth I, child of a mother who died by the sword, was once considered illegitimate, stripped of her title, pushed aside in the line of succession. She grew up in the shadow of whispers and suspicion. And yet, she carried her mother's intellect, her pride, her unshakable spirit. Under Elizabeth's reign, England entered its golden age, a time of political stability, cultural brilliance, and rise as a mighty force upon the seas. Without an Anne Boleyn, there would have been no Elizabeth. And without Elizabeth, England may have walked a very different path. Today, Anne is remembered not only as a betrayed queen, not only as a victim of a ruthless court, but as a woman who reshaped England's identity through a presence that was brief, but unforgettable. Her head may have fallen at the scaffold, but her ideas, her strength, her legacy, were never cut down. She remains a quiet testament to this truth, that sometimes the women brought to their knees in history are the ones who stand tallest in memory. Anne Boleyn did not live long, but the mark she left behind has endured through time. She was a woman who dared to say no to fate, who dared to love, to fight, and in the end, even after losing everything, she left behind a legacy that could never be erased. She was not only the mother of a queen, she was a woman who changed England forever. Thank you for joining me tonight, and for listening to her story. May your sleep be deep, your dreams peaceful, and until we meet again, here on Sleepy Historian, good night. Tonight's story comes to a close. If your eyes have gently shut, then I wish you a deep, peaceful sleep, until we meet again in the next dream.